where they were. They were very strongly motivated by that. And over time, as they were given upgraded equipment and training, they became a very important part of the ability of the South Vietnamese to defend themselves. The change tactics are important too and need to be mentioned. General Fred Wyand, who was a very close associate of Abrams, said the tactics changed within 15 minutes of Abrams taking command. And the way in which they changed was the emphasis on large operations and in the deep jungle changed to emphasis on small unit operations and those operations to be positioned more in between the enemy and the people, because Abrams understood that this was a war for the control of people. And if you position yourself so the enemy had to come to and through you to get to the people, first of all, if they came, the problem of finding them, which had plagued us in the earlier years, was much less. And secondly, if they engaged you, you had an opportunity to deal with them. But if they couldn't get through, then the people in the village and hamlet, if you got the infrastructure out, were going to be increasingly free. So that's the nature of the war in that second period. And by the way, things went extremely well, so much so that I was emboldened in a better war to say there came a point at which the war was won. I said the fighting hadn't ended, but the war was won, and the reason it was won was because the South Vietnamese had achieved the ability to maintain their independence and freedom so long as, crucial, conditional, so long as we kept the commitments that we had made to them. We come up to January of 1973, the Paris Accords, a supposed peace treaty that I mentioned earlier, were agreed to in Paris, and then pursuant to that agreement, we began to withdraw our forces. They were all out by the end of March 1973. Before that, in the spring of 1972, the enemy had mounted a major conventional invasion of the South across the so-called demilitarized zone in the north and through two places from the western borders that I talked about before. And a very fierce battle had ensued that lasted several months, but the South Vietnamese prevailed. Our ground forces by that time are almost entirely gone, and they don't play any part in that battle, although our air and naval forces did. And with support from them, the South Vietnamese were able to prevail and throw back that invasion of a force totaling the equivalent of about 20 divisions. So a very serious battle there. Some people then criticized the South Vietnamese, saying that they could not have prevailed except for American air support. That's a rather strange criticism because we had, at that time, we had hundreds of thousands of troops in Europe to help the European allies in the very same way should they need it. And we had about 50,000 troops in Korea to help the South Koreans in the same way should they need it. And nobody was criticizing them for not being able to defend themselves with American help. But in Vietnam, that, I think, very unfair criticism was leveled. By the way, General Abrams rose to that occasion. He said, I doubt that the fabric of this thing could have been held together without American air power, but if the South Vietnamese had not stood and fought as they did, 10 times the air power would not have allowed us to prevail. I'm just going to fast forward here to a period of January 1972, because that's rather late in our involvement there, and it's just before the Easter Offensive that I've talked about. One of the famous people in the war was a man named John Paul Vann, who was an Army officer early in the war and then went back and rose to a very senior position in the pacification program and was very highly regarded, especially by General Abrams. Vann said in January 1972, "We are now at the lowest level of fighting the war has ever seen. Today, there is an era of prosperity throughout the rural areas of Vietnam, and it cannot be denied. Today, the roads are open and the bridges are up, and you run much greater risk traveling any road in Vietnam today from the scurrying, bustling, hustling Hondas and Lambrettas than you do from the VC." Now, the end of the war in Vietnam is a Very, very sad case, and it is in part because, and there's no other way to describe it, we wound up abandoning the South Vietnamese. I told you about the crucial conditionals. We had promised the South Vietnamese that if there were renewed fighting, if the North Vietnamese violated the Paris Accords, we would reintroduce combat forces to punish those violations. We're talking air and sea power here. Secondly, we said that if there were renewed fighting, we would replace, as the Paris Accords permitted, we would replace major combat system losses on a one-for-one basis. That means artillery pieces, tanks, aircraft, things of that nature. And we said we would maintain robust financial support for the South Vietnamese for the indefinite future. And at a meeting in the Western White House, President Thieu of Vietnam and President Nixon of the United States, the figure of $1 billion a year was mentioned. When it came to the crunch, I'm sorry to say we defaulted on all three of those commitments, and meanwhile the North Vietnamese are getting much increased support from their patrons, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And as Tom Polgar, the last CIA station chief, said in his last brief message, outcome no longer in doubt. South Vietnamese cannot prevail without our help so long as the North continues robust support from its communist backers. Signed, Polgar, Chief of Station. So that's basically the end of that story. Now, I have only a little time left, and I want to say something about two groups of people who fought the war. First, I want to talk about the American veterans of the war in Vietnam. We have been hearing for a number of years now, and in fact it was mentioned as part of the theme of this conference, about the greatest generation, as christened, I think, by Tom Brokaw, those who fought World War II. That is a wonderful generation, and I'm extremely proud of them, and what I have to say is in no way denigrates that generation. My father is a part of that generation, a colonel of engineers in World War II. My uncle is a part of that generation, colonel of infantry, also in World War II, and my father also fought in the Korean War, so I'm very, very proud of them. But if I last long enough, I'm going to try to write a book, the title of which might be Also Great, and the subtitle might be The Generation That Fought the Vietnam War, because I think they're a marvelous generation that has not gotten the credit that they deserve. For example, very few people know, as B.G. Burkett points out in his wonderful book, Stolen Valor, 2/3 of Vietnam veterans volunteered for service. 2/3 volunteered for service. He said, compare that to the 33% of World War II veterans. In other words, the percentages are just the opposite. 1/3 of those in World War II volunteered, 2/3 were drafted. In Vietnam, 1/3 were drafted and 2/3 were volunteers. I doubt that many people know that. There are other things I could say, and I'll just, because there's so little time here, I'll just tell you this one thing. Not too long after the Vietnam War was over, the Veterans Administration got the Harris Polling Company, you probably know them, they do political polls and so on, got them to poll the people who had served in Vietnam and ask them certain questions. And the results were very interesting. 91% told the Harris pollsters they were glad they had served. 74% said they had enjoyed their time in service. And most impressive to me of all, 2 out of 3 said they would serve again, even knowing the outcome of the war. Those are great people, and we have every reason to be proud of them and grateful to them. And as I'm sure you've often heard, the only thing that was missing was when they came back from their service, a very few people said to them, thank you for your service, or welcome home, which are the things every veteran most wants to hear. The last thing I want to say to you is a word about the Vietnamese who fought that war. Very heroic people who fought for a long period of time under severe handicaps, which I've described very briefly, and when they got the wherewithal to do the job, did a wonderful job of that until essentially we pulled the plug on them.